In the middle of a bustling suburban neighborhood, tucked inside a freshly built condominium complex, lay a cluster of modern apartments that all shared the same gleaming feature: glass-paneled balconies stacked one atop another like transparent drawers pulled into the sky. For developers, it was a selling point, a design that invited light, community, and the open air into each unit. But for the residents, those same balconies became both a blessing and a curse. The community was ruled not by a single property owner, but by the Homeowners Association, a board elected from among the residents themselves. The HOA claimed to represent order, harmony, and community pride. Yet most tenants quickly learned it was really a stage for power struggles, grudges, and nitpicking rules designed to keep everyone in line. Among them, one resident stood apart. Her name was Mrs. Dillard, a retired school administrator who had lived on the fourth floor since the building first opened. Her reputation spread quickly. She was a self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, the type of neighbor who counted how many times your recycling bin appeared at the curb, or who left anonymous notes about the noise of your television. Mrs. Dillard found her calling in the balconies. She believed they were not just private extensions of apartments, but shared contributions to the building's overall appearance. To her, every balcony was part of the neighborhood's skyline, a public-facing display of taste and responsibility. And so, when she looked down from her fourth-floor perch and noticed the newcomer 2 floors below, the young tenant named Claire, she saw not just a neighbor, but a problem. Claire had moved in quietly, renting the unit on the 2nd floor after leaving a cramped studio downtown. At first, she drew little attention. She was polite, quiet, and often away at work. But her balcony betrayed her habits. Potted plants in terracotta containers, a string of solar fairy lights that twinkled faintly at dusk, and worst of all, in Mrs. Dillard's eyes, a foldable drying rack where Claire sometimes aired out laundry on warm afternoons. For Claire, these details were ordinary, harmless conveniences. For Mrs. Dillard, they were evidence of chaos. The HOA handbook, last updated 3 years ago, included vague clauses about balcony decor and visual uniformity. To someone like Mrs. Dillard, those words were an invitation to enforce her personal vision. The first ripple of tension spread one Tuesday morning when Mrs. Dillard took photos from her balcony of Claire's drying rack. She emailed them to the HOA board, with the subject line written in all caps: "Eyesore on 2nd floor. Urgent matter." She described the laundry rack as unsightly, slovenly, and detrimental to property values, warning that if left unchecked, the community would soon resemble a tenement rather than a luxury residence. The board, accustomed to her complaints, acknowledged receipt but took no immediate action. Days passed, and Claire continued to live normally, unaware of the brewing storm above. But the board's silence only enraged Mrs. Dillard. She printed copies of her photos and slid them under her neighbors' doors, urging them to take notice of the creeping decline. Some rolled their eyes, others ignored her. But a few, residents who feared property value dips as much as she did, began to grumble in agreement. The drama found its audience. Conversations by the mailboxes shifted to the topic of balcony clutter. Rumors swirled. One resident claimed Claire planned to hang rugs. Another whispered she was considering wind chimes. None of it was true. But perception mattered more than fact in the echo chamber of the HOA. When Claire received her first official letter typed on HOA stationery and stamped with the board seal, she was stunned. It cited improper balcony use and gave her 10 days to remove unauthorized items. She read the letter twice, confused. Unauthorized? The plants were healthy, the light subtle, the rack collapsible and neatly kept. Her balcony was clean, orderly, even charming. She assumed there must be a mistake. But when she asked her upstairs neighbor about it, she was met with a sigh and the words, "It's probably about the laundry rack. You've caught the eye of Mrs. Dillard." From that moment, the balcony was no longer just part of her apartment. It became contested ground, the opening battlefield in what would soon escalate into full-scale war. The first skirmish came when Claire complied halfway. She folded the drying rack and tucked it inside, leaving only her plants and lights. She assumed this compromise would satisfy the board. But from her fourth-floor vantage point, Mrs. Dillard saw defiance, not cooperation. To her, the plants were too wild, the lights too gaudy. She took new photos, wrote new emails, and lobbied harder than before. It wasn't long before the board called a special meeting to address the balcony issue. Residents gathered in the community room, where tensions rose with every seat filled. Mrs. Dillard presented her evidence in dramatic fashion, holding up photographs like courtroom exhibits. She spoke of visual pollution and slippery slopes, warning that if Clara's balcony remained unchecked, others would soon follow with flags, furniture, and, heaven forbid, grills. Claire attended quietly, seated in the back, her hands trembling as accusations flew. When asked if she wished to respond, she spoke softly, explaining her balcony was her sanctuary, that the plants gave her joy, and the lights harmed no one. Her words, calm and reasonable, contrasted sharply with the sharp-edged fury of Mrs. Dillard's presentation. The room split in sympathy. Some sided with Claire's right to personal expression, others with Dillard's call for uniformity. The board, unwilling to anger either side, postponed their decision. They promised to review the rules and deliver a verdict at a later date. The meeting adjourned, but the damage was done. Lines had been drawn, alliances whispered about in hallways, and glances exchanged with new meaning in the elevator rides that followed. Claire walked home feeling shaken, but also determined. Her balcony was hers, and she would not be bullied into stripping it bare. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dillard returned upstairs with a sense of unfinished business, her resolve only hardened by the delay. The stage was set. What began as a single drying rack had spiraled into a neighborhood divide, with residents whispering of a coming clash that would reach beyond the balconies and into the very identity of the community itself. The first sparks had flown, but in the weeks ahead, the flames of conflict would rise higher than anyone expected. And as the sun set over the glass-paneled complex, casting long shadows across the stacked balconies, one truth became clear. This was no longer about plants or lights or racks. It was about control, pride, and the battle for the sky above. In the days following the community meeting, tension clung to the hallways like damp air after a storm. The building that once prided itself on modern conveniences and glossy marketing brochures now buzzed with whispered speculation and nervous energy. Residents avoided eye contact at the mailboxes, careful not to reveal where their loyalties lay. For the first time since moving in, Claire felt as though every step she took, from the lobby to the elevator to her very front door, was under surveillance. On the second floor, her balcony remained intact. The neat row of plants, the string of solar lights, the small table where she sometimes placed her morning coffee. It was ordinary, peaceful, even charming. But from the fourth floor above, Mrs. Dillard saw nothing but rebellion. Each pot was proof of disobedience, each faint sparkle of the fairy lights a direct challenge to her authority. What had once been a simple hobby for Claire became, in Mrs. Dillard's mind, a calculated act of defiance. Unable to wait for the HOA's delayed verdict, Mrs. Dillard launched her own campaign. She began with her allies, residents who feared property values would plummet if clutter spread unchecked. She visited them one by one, standing in their doorways with folders of printed photographs. She warned them that Claire's balcony was just the beginning, that without intervention, their community would soon resemble a college dormitory rather than a luxury residence. Some residents agreed out of genuine concern, others simply nodded to avoid conflict. But a few, neighbors weary of Mrs. Dillard's constant complaints, quietly began to sympathize with Claire. They saw in her a victim, a quiet tenant unfairly targeted by someone who had long overstepped her role. The building divided itself into two invisible factions, those who backed uniformity and those who defended personal freedom. The first escalation came not in words, but in actions. Late one Friday evening, Claire returned home to find a folded note taped to her balcony door. The message was anonymous, typed on plain paper, but the tone was unmistakable. "This is not your private garden. Remove the plants or we will escalate further." Claire stood frozen, the note trembling in her hand. She knew immediately who had orchestrated it, even if the author had hidden their identity. The language carried the sharp cadence of Mrs. Dillard's speeches, thinly veiled behind anonymity. For the first time, Claire felt unsafe in her own home. Determined not to give in, she refused to remove her plants, but she began to notice subtle signs of surveillance. Each morning, when she stepped onto her balcony to water them, she could sense eyes on her from above. The sound of blinds shifting, the shadow of someone lingering near the glass railing, always from the fourth floor. By the following week, the conflict spilled beyond the building itself. A small post appeared in the community's private online forum. The title read, "Balcony Blight, a Threat to Our Property Values." The post included photos of Claire's balcony taken from an upward angle, clearly shot from Mrs. Dillard's own apartment. The captions described the plants as excessive, the lights as garish, and the balcony as an outright violation of HOA standards. The comments section erupted. Some neighbors chimed in with agreement, complaining that rules existed for a reason. Others defended Claire, pointing out that her balcony was tidy and tasteful compared to many apartments in the city. The thread grew heated, devolving into personal attacks, accusations of bullying, and calls for stricter enforcement. What had begun as a dispute between two women was now a building-wide spectacle, a drama played out in digital space as much as in the physical halls. The HOA board, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of complaints, scrambled to maintain order. They sent out a mass email to all residents, urging them to remain civil and promising that a final decision regarding balcony decor would be announced soon. But rather than soothing tensions, the announcement only inflamed them. Each side read it as confirmation that the board was taking their position seriously, that victory was within reach. Claire, meanwhile, resolved to hold her ground. She began spending more time on her balcony, not to provoke, but to reclaim her sense of peace. On warm evenings, she sat with a book under the glow of the solar lights, determined to enjoy the small sanctuary she had created. To her, it was an act of quiet resilience. But to Mrs. Dillard, watching from above, it was taunting. The conflict reached its second stage one humid evening in July. When the smell of barbecue drifted up from the first-floor balcony, another tenant, inspired by the debate, had decided to test the limits of balcony freedom by grilling outside. Though technically against fire regulations, the act emboldened Claire's defenders and horrified the uniformity faction. Mrs. Dillard seized the moment, sending a flurry of emails to the board. "You see what happens when one person breaks the rules? Anarchy spreads. This building is spiraling out of control." But the backlash did not stop there. Soon, other balconies began to sprout small acts of resistance. Colorful flower boxes here, a decorative flag there. It was as though Claire's stand had opened a floodgate of expression.
residents reclaiming the spaces they had long been too nervous to personalize. To Mrs. Dillard, this was the nightmare realized. To Claire, it was proof that she was not alone. The building was no longer simply a place of residence. It had become a battleground of aesthetics, values, and control. Each balcony was a banner, each decoration a declaration of allegiance. And through it all, Mrs. Dillard and Claire remained the central figures, symbols of the war being waged in glass and steel above the street. As summer deepened, tempers did too. Complaints multiplied, letters stacked in the HOA's inbox, and the whispers in the hallways grew louder. Neighbors no longer greeted each other with casual smiles. They assessed one another, scanning for signs of which side they stood on. The once pristine condominium, designed for harmony and elegance, now carried an invisible fracture line running from top to bottom. And through it all, the board prepared for its next move. A formal vote loomed, one that promised to decide the fate not just of Claire's balcony, but every balcony in the building. As the date approached, anticipation turned into dread. What would the board decide? Would they side with uniformity or freedom? Would Claire's sanctuary be dismantled, or would Mrs. Dillard's crusade finally be checked? The building held its breath, waiting for Judgment Day.
The day of the board's decision arrived with the weight of inevitability, hanging over the condominium like storm clouds that refused to move on. Notices had been slipped under every door earlier in the week. Special HOA meeting. Agenda, balcony regulation clarification. The wording was sterile, but everyone knew what it meant. This was not just about clarification. It was about judgment. By the time the evening sun dipped low, the community room on the ground floor was packed tighter than anyone had seen before. Folding chairs had been dragged in from storage, and still residents stood along the walls, arms crossed, expressions tense. The once friendly chatter that usually filled the room before such meetings was replaced with sharp whispers, the occasional sigh, and the sound of papers shuffling as neighbors clutched notes and printouts. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, 5 members in a neat row behind a long table. Each looked exhausted already, as though they understood the scale of the conflict they were about to preside over. They shuffled documents, avoided eye contact, and cleared their throats into microphones that squeaked under the pressure. Mrs. Dillard occupied a prominent seat in the audience, dressed in a stiff blazer despite the summer heat, her folder of photographs balanced neatly in her lap. She looked not like a resident, but like a prosecutor ready to deliver a closing argument. Claire sat several rows behind, quieter, her hands folded tightly together in her lap. She hadn't brought evidence, only her presence. The meeting opened with formalities. Roll call, approval of minutes from the last meeting, but the audience was restless. They wanted the main event. They wanted resolution. Finally, the chair of the board announced the subject at hand. Balcony regulations. A vote will be taken tonight to amend the bylaws for clarity and enforcement. The floor opened for statements. Mrs. Dillard was the first to rise. She delivered her speech with the conviction of someone who believed she alone stood between civilization and chaos. She held up photographs, warning of visual decay and property value erosion. She described balconies not as private spaces, but as extensions of our shared image. Her voice rang sharp, her words rehearsed, her gaze unwavering as she scanned the room for signs of agreement. A smattering of nods met her points. Some residents clapped lightly, more out of habit than passion. But others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, weary of her dramatic tone. When the board called for opposing views, Claire hesitated at first. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the hum of whispered voices. But slowly, she stood. Her voice was quiet, steady but edged with emotion. She spoke not of property values or rules, but of belonging. She described how the plants reminded her of the small garden she had left behind when moving to the city, how the lights gave her comfort after long workdays, and how her balcony was not a spectacle, but a sanctuary. Her words, simple and unpolished, cut through the room with an honesty that photographs and rules could not match. A few neighbors who had never spoken to her before nodded, visibly moved. For the first time, Claire felt the tide shifting, not entirely in her favor, but enough to make her realize she was not alone. The debate stretched late into the night. One resident complained about grilling on balconies. Another argued for seasonal decorations. Someone proposed an outright ban on all personal items, while another suggested guidelines rather than prohibitions. The board scribbled notes, occasionally raising hands to silence the room when arguments grew too loud. Finally, close to 10 o'clock, the chair announced it was time for the vote. The proposal on the table was simple, but heavy with consequence. To prohibit all non-standard items on balconies, including plants, lights, drying racks, and decorations, in the interest of uniformity and safety. The room fell silent. 5 board members raised their hands, one by one, 2 in favor, 2 opposed. And then came the deciding vote, the chair herself pausing long enough to make the air thick with suspense. She exhaled, raised her hand, and opposed. The proposal failed. For a moment the room was stunned into silence. Then the murmurs began, half relieved, half outraged. Mrs. Dillard's face stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line as she clutched her folder tighter. Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks, her shoulders dropping with the weight of reprieve. The board announced they would draft new, clearer guidelines in the coming months, but for now, no sweeping ban would be imposed. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Neighbors argued openly in the halls, some congratulating Claire with quiet smiles, others muttering that the building was doomed. Mrs. Dillard left quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her expression unreadable. That night, Claire stepped onto her balcony with a sense of cautious victory. The plants were safe, the lights twinkled softly, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe the battle might be over. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of blinds shifting above. She knew Mrs. Dillard well enough by now to understand this was no surrender. And she was right, because even as the board's decision spread through the building, Mrs. Dillard sat awake in her apartment, drafting new plans. If the board wouldn't enforce her vision, she would find other ways. She typed late into the night, her fingers striking the keyboard with the precision of a strategist plotting her next move. The vote was only the end of the first act. The true war, she believed, was just beginning.
The failed vote left the condominium in a fragile equilibrium, balanced precariously between relief and resentment. For those who valued freedom, it felt like a victory worth celebrating. For those who clung to uniformity, it was nothing less than betrayal. And for one resident in particular, it was the spark of vengeance. Mrs. Dillard could not accept defeat. In her mind, the board had abandoned its responsibility, the community had failed to see reason, and order itself had been left vulnerable. But she was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had lived too many years in classrooms, managing unruly students and enforcing discipline to believe that resistance could not be broken. If the board would not wield authority, she would. Her retaliation began quietly. At dawn, when the building was still, she descended the stairwells with a clipboard in hand, documenting every balcony in sight. She noted chipped paint, crooked furniture, neglected planters, even a forgotten broom leaning against the glass. To most residents, these were trivial details of daily life. To Mrs. Dillard, they were ammunition. She compiled the list into a 30-page dossier titled Evidence of Decline, and mailed copies directly to the property management company. But she didn't stop there. She began filing anonymous complaints with the city's code enforcement office, reporting supposed violations ranging from improper waste disposal to suspected fire hazards. Inspectors came and went, puzzled to find little wrong, but their visits unsettled the residents, fueling rumors of ongoing investigations. Each knock on a door, each slip of paper left behind, deepened the sense of unease in the building. Still, Mrs. Dillard wanted more than paperwork. She wanted humiliation. And so, she turned her attention back to Claire's balcony. On a humid evening in late July, Claire returned home to find her balcony transformed into a spectacle. Someone, though she had no doubt who, had scattered bird seed across her railing and floor. Within hours, pigeons had descended, leaving feathers and droppings behind. The neat sanctuary she had tended with care was suddenly filthy, invaded. She cleaned it up as best she could, but the message was unmistakable. This space is not yours. Days later, another incident followed. A notice appeared on Claire's door, not from the HOA, but typed anonymously. Residents are tired of your selfishness. Remove the clutter or face consequences. The paper was smeared with something sticky, a crude attempt at intimidation. Claire's hands trembled as she killed it off, her sense of safety eroding with each act of harassment. Word of the harassment spread quickly. Some neighbors expressed sympathy, quietly offering kind words in the elevator or leaving small gestures of support. Others avoided her altogether, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. The building's atmosphere shifted from mere tension to paranoia. Every creak of the hallway, every shuffled footstep outside a door, carried suspicion. And then came the boldest act yet. Late one night, Claire awoke to the sound of voices outside her window. She pulled back the curtain to see shadows on her balcony, figures retreating quickly into the darkness. When she stepped outside, she found her plants overturned, pots shattered, soil scattered across the concrete. The destruction was deliberate, calculated to wound more than the fragile stems it crushed. This time, Claire didn't stay silent. She reported the vandalism to the board, attaching photographs as evidence. The board, already exhausted by the ongoing conflict, issued a building-wide notice condemning harassment and warning that any resident caught damaging property would face fines and possible legal action. But their words rang hollow. Everyone knew enforcement was weak, and no one had the courage to accuse Mrs. Dillard by name. For her part, Mrs. Dillard remained careful. She kept her public actions within the bounds of concerned citizenry, framing herself as a victim of lax leadership rather than the instigator of unrest. She spoke to allies in hushed tones, framing Claire as the cause of division, the root of every disruption. To those who would listen, she painted herself as a protector of order, unfairly maligned for simply upholding standards. The retaliation escalated further, when the building's private forum once again lit up with new posts. Anonymous accounts began sharing exaggerated claims about Claire, alleging she left trash in common areas, that her plants attracted rodents, that her lights disturbed others' sleep. None of it was true, but repetition gave the lies weight. Soon, whispers spread in the halls, and Claire felt the sting of cold stares from neighbors she had never spoken to. In the isolation of her apartment, Claire felt cornered. Her balcony, once her safe haven, now seemed a target under constant threat. Yet, despite the pressure, she refused to surrender. She replaced the broken pots with new ones, brighter and larger than before. She cleaned the balcony thoroughly, hung her lights again, and sat outside in quiet defiance. To her, it was not just about plants or decor, it was about dignity. But Mrs. Dillard saw only rebellion, and rebellion, in her view, demanded stronger measures. Her next move would not be anonymous. It would be public, undeniable, and designed to rally the building against Claire once and for all. She began drafting flyers to distribute door to door, calling for an emergency petition to strip the board of authority and replace it with a stricter enforcement committee, her committee. At the top of her agenda, restoring the skyline, removing balcony blight. The building was no longer merely divided, it was at war. Every balcony became a statement, every glance a calculation, every whisper a weapon. And as the summer deepened into August, one thing was clear. The retaliation had only just begun, and the fight was far from over.
The flyers appeared overnight, slipped under doors, taped near elevators, pinned to the community corkboard by the mailboxes. Each bore the same bold headline, typed in sharp black letters. Restore the skyline. Sign the petition today. Below the title was a manifesto, written with precision and indignation. It warned of a dangerous precedent set by the board's failure to act, a decline in property values, and the risk of long-term community damage. The solution, it declared, was the creation of a special Skyline Committee, dedicated solely to balcony regulation and enforcement. And at the bottom, the name glared like a signature of inevitability. Mrs. Eleanor Dillard, 4th floor. For the first time, Mrs. Dillard abandoned the safety of anonymity. She made her crusade official, public, and impossible to ignore. The building reacted swiftly. By noon, small clusters of residents stood in the lobby, holding the flyers in their hands, debating their meaning. Some nodded in agreement, muttering about chaos and slippery slopes. Others rolled their eyes, tired of the relentless campaign. But no one was neutral anymore. You were either for or against. Within days, Mrs. Dillard began her rounds. Clipboard in hand, she knocked on doors, her blazer pressed, her smile tight and rehearsed. She presented her petition as a matter of community pride, asking each resident for their signature. Some signed immediately, eager to avoid confrontation. Others declined politely, only to find her pressing harder, reminding them of the risks and the eyesores. But Claire had allies now, quiet ones at first, who had grown weary of Mrs. Dillard's constant policing. A retired couple on the 5th floor, who loved their hanging flower baskets, refused to sign. A young family on the 3rd floor, who had recently put out a small toy bin for their children, also declined. Slowly, resistance took form. Yet Mrs. Dillard was relentless. She posted updates in the building's private forum, boasting of dozens of signatures already secured. She hinted that those who refused might be exposed as the reason property values dropped. Fear spread like a shadow, and even residents who privately disagreed began to worry about being on the wrong side of her campaign. Claire watched it unfold with a mix of dread and defiance. She knew her name was not on the petition, but she could feel its weight pressing down on her every time she stepped outside. Her balcony, still adorned with plants and lights, had become a rallying point, not just for her own freedom, but for the rights of everyone resisting the committee. Each evening she sat outside deliberately, a silent statement against the tide. The petition reached its peak when Mrs. Dillard announced an informal tally to be shared at the next HOA gathering. She claimed more than half the building had already pledged their support. Whether true or not, the number spread quickly, whispered in hallways and repeated in elevators until it felt like fact. Claire sensed the balance shifting dangerously. Then, in the middle of the campaign, came an unexpected twist. A resident on the 1st floor, an accountant by trade, asked to see the petition before signing.
When he reviewed the document, he noticed something unusual. Several signatures appeared suspiciously similar, written in the same hand with slight variations. He raised the issue quietly at first, asking neighbors if they had truly signed. A few shook their heads, baffled to learn their names were listed at all. Rumors of forged signatures spread quickly. Some accused Mrs. Dillard of inflating her support, of manufacturing consensus to intimidate others into compliance. She denied the accusations, insisting the errors were clerical mistakes from transferring signatures to her master list. But the damage was done. Doubt spread through the community, and her credibility wavered. Claire felt a surge of hope. For once, Mrs. Dillard was on the defensive. Yet the hope was tempered by caution. A cornered opponent was often the most dangerous, and at the next HOA meeting, the petition dominated the agenda. The community room was once again filled to the brim, the air charged with anticipation. Mrs. Dillard presented her petition with theatrical flourish, waving her clipboard and declaring that a silent majority supported her cause. She dismissed accusations of forgery as slander spread by those who profited from chaos. But the accountant stood and calmly explained what he had found. He held up copies of the petition, pointing to the repeated loops in the handwriting, the identical pressure points on different signatures. Murmurs rippled through the room. The board members exchanged glances, clearly uneasy. In the back row, Claire sat still, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had waited for, the first crack in Mrs. Dillard's iron grip. The board deliberated in hushed tones before making their announcement. The petition, they ruled, was invalid due to irregularities. The Skyline Committee would not be formed. Instead, the board promised once again to draft clear balcony guidelines, this time with resident input, and present them for a community-wide vote later in the year. For many, it was a relief. For others, a frustration. But for Mrs. Dillard, it was humiliation. She had staked her authority on this petition, and now it lay in tatters, exposed as flawed. Her allies avoided her gaze as they filed out of the room, unwilling to attach themselves to the stench of failure. Yet Claire knew better than to celebrate. She had seen the look in Mrs. Dillard's eyes as the board delivered its verdict, a look not of surrender, but of fury, the kind of fury that grew dangerous when cornered. As the meeting dispersed and neighbors returned to their apartments, the air was thick with uncertainty. The petition was dead, but the battle was far from over. Because in her fourth-floor apartment, Mrs. Dillard was already plotting her final move, one that would bypass signatures, debates, and boards altogether. Something more direct, something decisive. The building had survived the petition, but the storm was still gathering, and the climax of the balcony battle was yet to come.
The failure of the petition marked the beginning of the end. The building had grown weary of constant conflict, but Mrs. Dillard was far from finished. In her mind, the rejection wasn't a verdict against her. It was evidence that the board was weak, the community spineless. If signatures and speeches could not bring order, then action would. Her plan was simple, if reckless. Eliminate the problem directly. And to her, the problem had always been Claire's balcony. The first hint of what was coming arrived on a windy August evening. Claire returned home to find her balcony door slightly ajar. She froze, her pulse quickening. Had she left it unlocked, or had someone entered while she was away? She searched the apartment carefully, no signs of intrusion inside, but outside, on the balcony, her string lights hung severed, wires frayed as though cut with scissors.
The plants, though still standing, were unsettled, soil scattered across the floor by the wind. The message was clear. Claire reported the incident, but the board offered little more than sympathy and a promise to increase security patrols. She didn't believe them. She slept uneasily that night, the sound of every creak magnified in her mind, as though the building itself were conspiring against her. Days later, the confrontation everyone had feared finally arrived. It began quietly, with the smell of smoke. On a late afternoon, as the sun sank and residents returned from work, a haze drifted across the building's balconies. Neighbors leaned over railings, pointing, whispering. The smoke was rising from Claire's floor, though not from her balcony. It came from the stairwell, where a smoldering pile of paper and debris had been left burning in a metal trash bin. Someone had lit it deliberately. The flames never spread. The sprinklers extinguished the danger before it grew, but the symbolism was unmistakable. It was an act of intimidation, reckless and dangerous, carried out within steps of Claire's apartment. Panic gripped the building. Residents crowded the sidewalks outside as firefighters inspected the scene, their flashing lights bouncing across the glass facade. Parents clutched children. Elderly tenants shook their heads in disbelief. Rumors spread quickly. Was it an accident or something more sinister? Claire stood among them, silent, her clothes damp from the sprinklers. She didn't need rumors to tell her what she already knew. And then came the final straw. The next morning, as residents trickled back to their routines, Mrs. Dillard made her move. She emerged onto her fourth-floor balcony carrying a bullhorn of all things. With the calm air of authority, she addressed the courtyard below, declaring that the fire was a direct consequence of neglect and disorder, and demanding once more that the building take serious action against those who polluted the skyline. Her voice echoed off the concrete walls, startling children, drawing phones into hands as neighbors recorded the spectacle. Claire stood frozen on her balcony, staring upward at the woman whose shadow had loomed over her for months. Around them, residents began to shout, not in agreement, but in anger. Enough was enough. One by one, voices rose from balconies, from windows, from the ground-floor courtyard. They shouted back, condemning the harassment, calling out the intimidation, denouncing the endless campaign. For the first time, the silence of fear broke. The building itself seemed to roar with defiance, drowning out Mrs. Dillard's amplified voice until she faltered, then retreated indoors. The board acted swiftly. With the weight of the community finally united, they issued an emergency vote to censure Mrs. Dillard. She was stripped of her committee roles, barred from posting in the online forum, and warned that further harassment would lead to legal action. Property management, now alerted to the fire and its suspicious timing, launched a separate investigation. And just like that, the tide turned. Claire's balcony remained intact, a quiet symbol of survival. Her plants thrived, her lights glowed, and for the first time she could sit outside without fear of retaliation. Neighbors who had once been strangers stopped by to compliment her resilience. Some even inspired to add their own touches of color and life to their balconies. What had begun as a solitary act of personal joy had grown into a quiet revolution of expression across the building. Mrs. Dillard, meanwhile, retreated into isolation. Curtains drawn, balcony bare, she no longer prowled the halls with her clipboard or distributed flyers under doors. Some said she was too ashamed to show her face. Others whispered she was biding her time. But the truth was simpler. She had lost. Her crusade, once fueled by righteous certainty, had collapsed under the weight of her own obsession. The building slowly returned to normal, though scars remained. Trust would take time to rebuild, and memories of smoke and shattered pots would not fade easily. But the community had learned something in the process, that fear only thrived in silence, and that unity could withstand even the loudest voice. As summer gave way to autumn, Claire watered her plants one crisp morning and looked up at the stacked balconies above. They no longer felt like battlements in a war.
They were what they were meant to be. All along, spaces of individuality, of life, of sky. The battle for the skyline was over, and in the end, it wasn't rules, petitions, or threats that decided it. It was resilience.